On to a very important debate in a few moments. If those leaving can leave quietly and quickly, that'd be great. Our next subject is a very important matter to all of us in our constituency duties, that we are going to consider the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. And it's a pleasure to call upon Jo Platt to move the motion. Jo Platt.
Thank you, Mr Streeter, and it's a great honour to serve under your chairmanship. A few months ago, the enormity of the struggles and barriers that those with ADHD face on a daily basis was brought to my attention by an inspirational woman who approached me in the hope that we could establish an APPG on ADHD. 7 months later, I proudly chair that APPG along with the member for Faversham and Mid-Kent. We have held our launch, our first meeting on the economic impacts of ADHD. And now today we have our first parliamentary debate on the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. That inspirational woman is Michelle Beckett, the founder and CEO of ADHD Action, an incredible charity set up to support and offer advice to people struggling with their condition. Everyone on the APPG, some of who are here today, would, I'm sure, agree that we would not be here today without Michelle's work and dedication to the issue. I'd therefore like to place on record my thanks and those of the APPG to Michelle for the incredible work that she does. In the months since we created the APPG, I have become ever more shocked at the stories and experiences shared with us about the diagnosis and treatment process that has been letting people down. It has been letting people down in 3 ways. The first is through stigma and attitudes. This is true of mental health more generally, and I am pleased that this debate is here during Mental Health Awareness Week, a yearly reminder of the progress yet to be made to treat mental health in parity to physical health. Looking at societal attitudes to ADHD in particular, we see a variety of misconceptions and stigmas. ADHD is often seen as a condition to only affect boys, sometimes interpreted as the product of poor parenting, or just excused as naughty children playing up. All of these are false. But the impact of these misconceptions is enormous. Children may not be offered the correct support they need, and adults with the condition are often undiagnosed or even unaware that they may have ADHD. An undiagnosed child in school without the support they need will in most likelihood fall behind their classmates and struggle to obtain top grades. Of all school exclusions, almost half are pupils with special educational needs. This is a truly shocking statistic that underlines the importance of exploring further ADHD-specific policies, maybe within the Mental Health Green Paper or as part of the SEND Code of Practice. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. As you know, ADHD can continue into adulthood. A constituent of mine is lobbying for it to be given the recognition it deserves. Does my honourable friend agree that ADHD should be classed as a disability for the purposes of the law, including accessing benefits?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. My honourable friend is right. You know, we do need more awareness with regards to ADHD. And I know that people who do suffer with ADHD, they have called for their own act, as we have the Autism Act of something similar. In the midst of cuts to school nursing provision and a school funding and teacher recruitment and retention crisis, this is no fault of our hard-working, dedicated and professional healthcare workers and teachers, but the product of an underfunded and under-resourced health and education system. We can't go on treating children with ADHD simply as naughty kids or unable to afford the time or resources to help them. Instead, we must support these young people and focus their education around their skill set. The second way we are letting those with ADHD down is through diagnosis. A recent survey with over 800 responses revealed that 70% of respondents had waited 18 months or more for an ADHD diagnosis. 9% of which was shockingly waiting over 3 years. I'll give way.
I recently asked 3 parliamentary questions around waiting times for assessments for ADHD, and all 3 the responses were that those figures were not collated. We can't do anything about it until we have accurate data. Do you not agree with me that the Minister and the Department should be collating that data?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I thank my honourable friend as he is the Vice Chair on the APPG for ADHD. And he is absolutely right to mention that the lack of data obviously causes a mismatch of a bit of a postcode lottery, which is something that I'll address later on in this speech. So this was reflected at our recent APPG meeting, where we heard stories of people waiting years for a diagnosis, years battling without the support or guidance they need, falling back in school, or years struggling in their occupation. We've heard stories like my constituent Mick, whose son has suffered enormously, falling into crime before he was diagnosed, which is unfortunately an all too common occurrence in prisons, where about 25% of male prisoners are thought to have ADHD. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I congratulate my honourable friend on securing this very important debate. She's mentioned the figure of 25% of prisoners, male prisoners, being thought to have ADHD. Does she agree with me that with early intervention and diagnosis of ADHD, this will not only help reduce crime and save money, but will improve the life chances of people with ADHD falling into the criminal justice system?
I completely agree with my honourable friend. ADHD in the criminal justice system is an area that evidently needs a lot more investigation. And we have a statistic, the simple fact that 24% of the prison population are estimated to have ADHD is a cause of concern. I'll give way.
I congratulate her on bringing the debate. I draw attention to my declarations of members' interests. But one of the key issues here, it seems to me, is to enable early diagnosis and to enable any diagnosis at all. It's about having the workforce in place. And recruitment into CAMS, specialist CAMS doctors, is a real problem. And unless we get that right, I'm sure she would agree that we're not going to actually deliver the service that patients and their families deserve.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention and completely agree that, again, it is with regards to workforce that we need to highlight this. But I think before we do that, we need the data to be able to see how many people that we need in these, in all workforces. And again, it's something I'm going to come on to later on in my speech. I'll give way on that point.
I'm very grateful, and I congratulate them on bringing the debate to today. And would you agree with me, one of the additional complexities in terms of workplace is the bureaucracy of the workplace assessment. And if the Minister takes anything away for today for those living with ADHD in adulthood, that this process needs review as a matter of urgency in terms of its effectiveness and impact of those with ADHD in the workplace.
I completely agree. Again, obviously, we've just focused on young people and obviously within the school setting, but obviously this affects adults enormously. I want to come back to a message that I received from a constituent, Diane, who felt that she was different at school. And I think it goes back to your point as well, where, again, it's adults that this affects too. Diane went under the radar as she was high functioning. She passed her GCSEs but failed at university as she felt that she could not concentrate. Diane developed mental health issues and has spent most of her life on antidepressants, which she found did not work. She was unable to keep a job or a relationship, and in her 30s she tried to take her own life. It was only when her doctor advised her to be tested for ADHD and she was treated appropriately that her life has turned around. And this is not an uncommon story. Since this debate was publicised on the House of Commons Facebook page last week, it is clear that the scale of the diagnosis crisis is even greater than I could have imagined. The post was seen by 37,000 people and was engaged by over 1,000 people shared right across the country. We saw stories of 5-year waits and longer, people forced to get a private diagnosis costing up to £1,000, and stories of children in school without the support they need. I urge the Minister to head over to the Commons Facebook page and read some of the powerful stories. After reading these stories, I could not help but think how in 2018 can our healthcare provision be so unresponsive to a condition that affects so much of the population. Mr Chair, you may have noted that I quoted a survey earlier and did not state what the average waiting time is for a diagnosis across the country. That is because such information is not collected by the NHS or the Department for Health and Social Care. We have no idea what the average wait for diagnosis is, and therefore there are no target times. Instead, from the unofficial data collected, we are likely encountering a vast postcode lottery, which is unfairly dictating the speed of a diagnosis and then the support available. So just take the comment of Sian on Facebook. Her son in Wigan has received excellent care, which she described as life-changing. However, she teaches in a neighbouring constituency where children are waiting more than a year for diagnosis and encounter a far more confusing process. Without this diagnosis data, we have no way of either assessing the effectiveness of the current diagnosis process or identifying areas of good practice. This must be collected before we can begin to assess our treatment strategies. The third way we are letting people down is through the lack of integrated support, a support strategy for those with ADHD. By looking at each impact of ADHD in isolation, in just medical terms or just an educational setting, the behavioural impact and the social implications of the condition, we as a society are failing to offer the whole system approach to ADHD and mental health more generally that is needed. It is needed because tackling ADHD should be with the aim of transforming lives, not just responding to symptoms, but working to unlock the full potential of the incredibly creative minds that those with the condition possess. As we can see, Mr Chair, the current approach to ADHD is not fit for purpose. Too many are falling through the net, too many are still waiting today for a diagnosis after years on a waiting list. Too many are without the right support, and too many are living undiagnosed with a condition that can severely impact their daily life. That is why I've brought this debate here today, because of stories like Becky's, Sam's, Hugh's, Sarah's, Claire's, or the countless others who got in contact with me out of desperation, and I know who will be watching today. So what changes do we need? Firstly, there needs to be more research. A recent report published by Demos highlighted that ADHD is under-researched, particularly into the social and economic impacts of ADHD. There also needs to be research into the different early access to diagnosis and treatment to the long-term outcomes and cost of people with ADHD. Secondly, the NHS and the Department for Health and Social Care need to collect the data on waiting times. As we have seen, there is a vast postcode lottery across the country that determines the speed of diagnosis and the level of support offered. This system is grossly unfair and is reducing the life chances of people based on purely where they live. Thirdly, we need a streamlined and integrated approach to the support process we offer to children and adults with ADHD. As I have just mentioned, those living with the condition are no less able, but are often not suited to the traditional methods of learning. Instead, we must implement a strategy that diagnoses an individual and ADHD speedily, but is then crucially signposted and tracked through a system that promotes the educational or employment opportunities suited to their skill set. More broadly, this means that, as a society, we must be unafraid to promote the untraditional or unconventional routes to success, to promote the creative industries and to destroy the social stigma that too often forces individuals down the academic route. In my own borough of Wigan, we have seen the beginnings of such an approach. The local CCG has implemented a new joint mental health strategy. The strategy is designed to facilitate the seamless interaction of healthcare professionals with support services and education providers. And the early signs are promising. Already we have seen the average local wait down from 15 to 6 weeks, which will help numerous local young people to thrive. However, there is still a long way to go. This strategy only addresses ADHD in children, and its implementation is too recent to see the long-term local impact. The local nature of the strategy also highlights yet again the importance of a national framework to achieve equality of provision across the country. I'll give way on that point.
Is one friend aware of the government's mental health green paper, and is she aware as whether it contains anything of substance in relation to ADHD, any strategy or any other sort of issues? And if it doesn't, does she think it should contain that?
Thank you for that intervention. The Green Paper is a step in the right direction, but clearly doesn't go near enough to confront the enormity of mental health challenges and other challenges. And in the case of ADHD, it's important to remember that the condition is neurodevelopmental and not a mental health issue. So I wanted to end my speech today by asking a final ask of the Minister. I'd like to invite the Minister to a meeting of the APPG for ADHD to listen to some of the experiences people with the condition and understand the barriers that they face. The reality is that ADHD is highly treatable and in many, many ways a great asset, but only if it's harnessed correctly. Therefore, on this Mental Health Awareness Week, I hope we can commit to the beginning of a fundamental transformation in our approach to ADHD, because no longer can people be waiting years, if not decades, for diagnosis. No longer can social stigma form a barrier against success, and no longer can we leave such enormous talent locked, restricted and hidden away in society. Now is the time to act, and I hope that we will see from the government the strategy and the leadership needed to support those with ADHD and break down the barriers to success that thousands across the country are facing today. Thank you, Chair.
Very much indeed. Minister to respond, Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Streeter. And could I congratulate the Honourable Lady, the member for Lee, not just for the passionate and articulate way she's just articulated this very important subject, but also on setting up the all-party group. And I would be delighted to accept her invitation to come and engage and hear some of the stories, because I'd also like, through her, to extend my congratulations to Michelle Beckett for raising awareness too. I mean, she's highlighted this afternoon that actually this is a group of people who are facing actually quite intense, if unconscious, discrimination because the way that our education system is set up doesn't really address their needs, and that's something that we should all wish to tackle. And there are similarities actually with how we've treated in autism in the past, but also conditions such as dyslexia, where if the abilities to learn aren't there, people can fall out of the system. But the truth is that they have a very different skill set, and that's something that we should all be endeavouring to draw out and, at the very least, not make them feel that they're being marginalised or discriminated against. Because, as we've heard from other members, it's that sort of discrimination that leads them to fall out of the mainstream and perhaps fall into the criminal justice system, which is something that could be easily avoided if we were all more sensitive to it. She's mentioned about data, and I'm going to take that away straight away to look at that. But it's fair to say that it's only very recently that the NHS has started to collect data regarding autism. And again, for exactly the same reasons she's highlighted today, because there is a postcode lottery in terms of how different areas treat this condition, and quite often it depends on having somebody in the area who gives a damn to give some leadership on this issue, and clearly that's not good enough, because that's going to be failing far too many people. So I will go away and look at that, because we have just introduced some new data set for autism, and I don't see any reason why we can't extrapolate that methodology to look at ADHD. But there is no doubt we will continue our dialogue on these issues further on. Sorry.
Way. And on the, I think she's absolutely right to highlight the issue of data or lack of data. I was wondering when she goes away to look at this, whether it's worth also looking at, in the interest of parity of esteem, introducing access targets in mental health for access to CAM services, who do a lot of the assessment of people with ADHD, and whether that is something that would help to drive better data collection in the NHS, because if you're measuring against a target, it enforces local healthcare providers to collect the data that's necessary to drive improvements in the system.
Well, I'm just about to come on to issues about waiting time standards. I think the methodology is absolutely right that he says, because in terms of, in a sense, I mean, although it's Mental Health Awareness Week and we're looking at it through that prism, this is not just about mental health. This is about a learning disorder in the same way, and it goes beyond that. So rather than compartmentalising people who fall out of the mainstream into mental health, I think that was equally discriminatory, but we still need to make sure we've got the right care pathways for them in order that we meet their needs.
Briefly.
Come across discriminatory in the point that I made, but it is CAMS professionals mental health professionals who tend to do the assessments for ADHD in children. And I just wondered, what is she going to do to deal with a recruitment crisis in CAMS? Because without the CAMS professionals, we're not going to be able to provide the diagnosis and delivery of care.
Well, my honourable friend will be aware that we've addressed these issues in the Green Paper. We are investing in a whole new workforce that will be in support of CAMS, and will have a direct relationship with schools, where, again, a lot of this wraparound help will be able to take place also. But perhaps if I could make progress with the specifics about ADHD and move on from CAMS. As the honourable member has highlighted, there is massive variation in services across the country, and I do fully acknowledge that there are long delays for some to see a specialist and secure a diagnosis, and clearly that will have a negative impact on those living with ADHD, not just them, but also their families, who can find the experience quite confusing also. And we are determined to see improvements in that patient journey. I can say that there are NICE guidelines governing this. Obviously, the earlier the diagnosis, the better, and the better chance of getting the right support and the better outcomes for the individual. The NICE guidelines were published in 2016, and they set out the process for managing ADHD for people aged 3 years and above. These guidelines aim to improve the diagnosis of ADHD as well as the quality of care and support for people with an ADHD diagnosis, and an updated guideline was published in March this year. In particular, the revised guideline addresses underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis of ADHD in girls. And I think, again, this is an area where people think it's just about behaviour, but obviously in girls it doesn't quite play out in exactly that way. So there is a lot to be done in terms of education as to exactly what this condition is, because, as she said, people think it's about bad parenting or bad behaviour when it's actually something much more complex. The guideline advises practitioners to be alert in such circumstances to the possibility of ADHD, and I do think we will be failing girls unless we raise awareness of how that might be playing out. The guideline also recommends that people with ADHD will benefit from improved organisation of care and better integration of child health services and adult mental health services and CAMS. And while NICE clinical guidelines are not mandatory, we do expect them to be taken fully into account by health and care professionals and by commissioners as they design and put in place services to meet the needs of their local populations. NICE has also published a range of tools to help local areas put the guidance into practice. But clearly that's not happening everywhere, and we need to... I always find that sunlight's the best disinfectant, so the more we can do in terms of transparency, the better, and that's why data is so important, as she has said. The NICE guideline does not recommend at this time a waiting time to see a specialist for diagnosis, but it does recommend that for children whose behaviour is suggestive of ADHD, that parents should be also offered referral to group-based ADHD-focused support without waiting for a formal diagnosis, and clearly that would be helpful, but we should really look at the whole question of waiting times. One area I'm particularly concerned about, and again I'd look forward to engaging with the APPG on this, is the whole support in schools, as the Honourable Ladies mentioned. And there is some evidence that in terms of getting the right support package for children with ADHD can be challenging for some institutions. And what I'm particularly concerned about is anecdotal evidence that these people are being excluded disproportionately. And again, that's some of the discrimination that we really do need to tackle. And perhaps I could ask the APPG to see what we could do between us to look at what extra support we can give to schools to give them better advice to support children with this condition, rather than just simply marginalise them. The Children and Families Act 2014 and the Special Needs Code of Practice clearly sets out ways in which the care services should join up. But clearly we need to hold those areas to account. But we do expect CCGs and local authorities to properly work together to support the needs of children with a special educational need or disability, including ADHD. And this includes coordinated assessment of individual needs, and for those with greatest needs, an individual education, health and care plan. And again, I'd be interested to hear her evidence from the APG, how many children are not receiving these plans. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend that everything's perfect, because I know perfectly well that we're not. But I think we have an opportunity between us to actually highlight where practice is good and where local authorities and CCGs can learn from that good practice, and to actually also highlight when people are being failed. Yes, indeed.
We're looking to see about best practice. I raised the question with the Honourable Member for Lee around the Department for Work and Pensions and the workplace assessment. Would they consider speaking to their colleagues in the DWP to see how effective it is for adults with ADHD in the workplace?
Well, I'd be happy to look into that in response to the Honourable Member's question. We are clearly, as a government, we are trying to encourage as many people into work as possible. We want to achieve the targets of 1 million people with disabilities, additional 1 million people with disabilities into work. And actually, where employers can just treat people with some sensitivity, people with ADHD can be a very valuable position in the workforce. So I'll be happy to take that conversation forward with my colleagues in DWP to encourage exactly that, because, as I've said, these people have a skill set, and it's a skill set which could be extremely productive for an enlightened employer who are prepared to actually make the concessions to work with them effectively. We've mentioned data. As I said, I do acknowledge that this is an issue, and without robust comparable data on waiting times, we do not have the tools with which to challenge local areas. But we can have the evidence that honourable members can bring anecdotally in advance of us being able to put together a suitable data set. I've already asked my officials to explore with NHS Digital what data can be made accessible via the mental health data set. But I think also this is an area where we do need to work alongside the Department for Education, where clearly it is in schools where people with ADHD still begin to manifest their issues. Coming back to the issue of employment, I think a number of honourable members have raised the importance of raising employment, improving outcomes for people with ADHD. And again, unless we can get them into meaningful employment, there will be obviously the risk that they fall into the criminal justice system, quite unnecessarily, actually. It's not just about earning a living. It will contribute to their psychological well-being, give them a sense of belonging and purpose, give confidence and self-esteem. As I said many, many times, work is good for your health, and we need to ensure that nobody is excluded. People with ADHD can be well-skilled and highly qualified and employable individuals with exceptional and unique talents that can bring real benefits to businesses. And I'd be more than happy to go and bang the drum to encourage more employers, just as they should actually be more sensitive to people with autism who equally have a very big skill set that they can offer an employer. So in closing, I've not very much time left. I'd just like to thank honourable members for their contributions today. I think this is a group of people who have been poorly served for a very long time. And in that spirit, I really welcome the establishment of the All-Party Group. I look forward to ongoing dialogue with all members of it. And I would hope that in not too long a time, we can actually achieve some material differences and improved outcomes for all these people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question is that this House has considered the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD.